Welcome to the Mobile UK Living Better Connected inaugural podcast. This is our first podcast of the series. Today we're going to be talking about net neutrality. It's a concept of how the open internet works, but equally it drives certainly some passions. But today we have with us Roslyn Layton, who is the Senior Vice President at Strand Consult, the Senior Contributor to Forbes magazine, and a visiting researcher at, I hope I say this right, Aalborg University, Centre for Communications, Media and Information. It's a real delight to have you here. I mean, I offer you the chance to say hello, Roslyn.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be with you on your inaugural podcast.
Brilliant. So we're here to talk about net neutrality. It is a concept that really drives passions. It's considered the open internet, the free internet. But certainly it's an issue you've studied and it's part of your PhD. But you have views that net neutrality in the modern age doesn't necessarily give the sort of the innovation or works for consumers or even the deployment of technologies that underpin it. Can you just outline that really?
Surely. Well, net neutrality itself doesn't have a definition in law. There are a variety of ways that people define it, but in my case, when I did my studies of this, I looked at 50 countries with different types of net neutrality rules over 5 years before and after rules were in place. And essentially what net neutrality does is put a set of price controls on broadband and traffic controls. So it essentially says that the price of all data must be the same, you have to have a uniform price, and the traffic cannot be managed, if you will. All the traffic has to have a kind of first in, first out. So you can't prioritize the traffic. You can't, give certain services an advantage over others, that sort of thing. Now, that might be fine. And you say, well, what does that matter? Well, there are ways that it has negatively impacted consumers. And we saw that most directly during the pandemic because technically under European rules, end users were not allowed to get free healthcare online or free education online. And this was extremely devastating for many people who, of course, couldn't work. They couldn't go to school.
In the pandemic in particular, that was a time when people were now having to work from home. The only access they had was through the internet.
Right, exactly. And technically, if you take the net neutrality rules at face value, and again, they're interpreted, maybe more aggressively in some countries than others, but essentially if you've got some kids in UK, they live in a home where there's only a smartphone connection, that's their lifeline to get to school every day is through that mobile phone. And it was not legal to provide free education services, free data to deliver that education. Now, fortunately, Ofcom, which is the UK's telecom regulator, they suspended the rules and they allowed the mobile operators of UK to work with different educational parties so that this data could be delivered to the students of the UK. And thank goodness they did that relatively quickly. But understandably, UK broadband providers were very concerned about violating the rules because they come with a lot of penalties. But the point is just, it's time to examine a policy that is just lacking common sense. In our modern digital world, we want to enable networks so that people can get healthcare online, so that they can work from home, so that they can learn from home, so that they can take advantage of these next generation services. And you can do that by having the pricing freedom and the pricing innovation and this goes on in other countries. It goes on outside the EU every single day without problem. There are plenty of countries without net neutrality rules and they just use their existing rules for competition. That's all we're talking about here.
In some way, people might explain that, and I think this is particularly important at where we are at the moment. We have a cost of living crisis, there's inflation, and big issue is access and affordability. But one of the terms that you often hear thrown around with net neutrality is a slow lane or a fast lane, and everyone should have access to the same lane. But as we're sort of talking here, the opportunity to offer zero-rated access, or especially, as we said, it wasn't just health, it was, for instance, domestic abuse sites and things, being able to enable people to access them. So in some ways, actually a fast lane for those that really want a heavy use of the internet, gaming, virtual reality, augmented reality. but then a lane for those that want to maybe pay less for a lesser internet. I mean, again, that seems not a bad principle, but the net neutrality doesn't allow that.
No, in fact, it really doesn't exist. That was a talking point created to promote these rules, which were adopted in the EU in 2015 without any regulatory impact assessment, without any empirical evidence. They were simply brought forth, and in some countries that have tried them have since removed them. So this, basically the idea here is, what does the consumer want and need? And what are the capabilities of the network and how best to deliver that? What net neutrality says is that all data has to be priced the same, regardless of the value to you as the consumer. And that tends to serve gamers who will use a lot of data. It gives them essentially a lower price for their broadband subscription. But let's say if you're a low-income person, it makes your connection arguably more expensive. And you're not allowed to do discounts and free offers to get around that. So this policy on its face is not consumer friendly. What we know from telecommunications, the whole history over 100 years, what we know from the practices in emerging countries where they have legitimately large populations of people who are impoverished, they have much more innovation in their broadband subscriptions than you have in UK today. So if I go to South Africa, I can choose from a far larger range of ways to buy broadband in different amounts, in different elements. I just want one service. I just want this time of day. I just want so and so. I have much more freedom as a consumer to get my broadband subscription. If I go to the UK, I have a limited range of what I can do. And I think that Ofcom, to their credit, having gone through the pandemic, now that it is charged with modernizing the internet framework going forward, UK wants to be a global leader in internet. It's actually looking at consumers and what's best for them. And they see that consumers want to buy premium subscriptions, consumers want more choice, they want more flexibility. And certainly UK's broadband providers want to offer that, but the rules need to be updated to allow that to happen.
And just on that innovation point, it's fascinating in your report, you look at sort of the international comparison of where the UK was pre-net neutrality and the amount of large internet companies it had, what happened then, I think 2015, when those net neutrality regulations were brought in, and where we are today. And the suggestion is that it is impeding innovation. There is no... We don't really have a Google or a Meta or an Alphabet in the UK, and I think you suggested, for instance, up to nearly 400 million could be sort of brought back into the economy without net neutrality regulation.
Yes, so there are two issues there. Let me take the innovation point first. I was most interested to see that the countries that had adopted the so-called hard net neutrality rules, which is these rules based in law with price controls and the traffic controls and a fine if you violated them. I was interested to see, did they get more innovation because of their net neutrality rules versus the countries that just adopted soft approaches, whether a multi-stakeholder model, something that the UK had in 2015, or they just use competition law, which is the case in Australia and New Zealand. So what I found is there's no advantage to using a hard rule approach, absolutely zero advantage. Most of the innovation, I'd say 95%, comes from countries either with soft rules or just competition law. There's no advantage conferred from the regions which adopted hard rules. If it was the case, then we would be getting our apps from Chile and India and Netherlands, but we don't. We essentially use apps from China, which never had these rules. We use apps from the USA. And, a number of countries, South Korea has quite been successful in exporting its particular content and innovation, and increasingly so. So this whole point that, the law is saying we're going to guarantee this internet and this engine of innovation has not been proven out over this almost decade that the rules have been in place.
I think in your report, you pointed it was a stark statistic. I think it was 2% of innovative companies or innovation coming out of Europe, which has these hard regulations, and we're seeing other countries fast, approaching that and potentially surpassing that.
Yes, well, it was quite stark because, not only did Europe not produce over this period, we're talking to 2015 today, since those rules were implemented, Europe as a whole has declined as a producer of internet innovation and as a measure of the total internet market value. So Europe may be, an important region in many people's minds, but it's less than 2% of the world's total of the internet market value. And it's so small that it will be surpassed by Africa later this year. So that simply shows that Africa is growing in its internet innovation. They are adopting new technologies. They are creating the companies in Africa to serve their needs, and they're the companies that are growing. We certainly can see that US companies, Chinese companies, they are taking greater share of the total global internet market value. But the share of European firms continues to decline, and I measure that in the rank of the firms as well as the market value. And sadly enough, I recall when I started my studies back in 2010, there were many UK enterprises in the top 100, and there's maybe one today. So it has really been unfortunate because there is so much human capital in the UK. It has so much capability. We see the UK innovating in many other spheres, but not in internet innovation. UK certainly innovates in fintech, for example, where it's very much less regulated. Of course, there's different banking regulations, but if in fact the UK wants to be this global leader in internet technologies or in 5G or whatever the case may be, it needs to adopt a more modernized internet policy. The countries that lead on 5G today, US, China, South Korea, Japan, none have these hard net neutrality rules at all.
So
And
you
because
say that net neutrality is actually, we're stagnating with those rules, and in some instances actually impeding
yes.
the opportunity.
Well, the statistic I cite, I use some numbers from various investment banks that have studied the financial impact of net neutrality rules, as well as a number of economists who have studied the impact of net neutrality on investment. And basically, the UK is suffering about 340 million pounds of lost investment per year. And that means that if you look at the gap today to get to where you want to be on 5G, which I think is something around 25 to 30 billion pounds, and under the best circumstances, I think that the UK can do something like 10 billion, status quo, not changing anything else.
Yeah,
that's still
the digital connectivity for us.
Yes. So there's still a large shortfall that is needlessly being impeded because you have a set of rules that does not let you allow to offer your consumers enhanced subscriptions, premium subscriptions, ability to manage your networks more efficiently, ability to do partnerships, a whole range of things that these rules, because they want to preserve some sort of aesthetic concept, they actually don't allow in practice what consumers want, what businesses need. And so this gap, I think that is what Ofcom wants to address. And also, I think the ministry, which is the DCIT, Digital Services, help me out on that.
Innovation and Technology, which used
yes.
to be DCMS.
Exactly. So I think that they understand that if they want to close this gap with 5G, that they're going to need to modernize the internet policy. And by the way, this is not just about getting, better, cheaper subscriptions or more data or whatever. This is also about innovating new industries. I mean, you want to have advanced manufacturing. You want to have creative industry innovation. You want to have better online healthcare capabilities. In the US today, there's over 4,000 small and medium-sized enterprises that participate in what's called the titanium economy. This is the 5G-enabled set of new firms in the advanced manufacturing sector where they use AI, they use quantum computing, robotics, and they're all sort of clean factories doing inputs to rockets, doing new electronic vehicle inputs, creating new green solutions for sanitation and waste management and so on. There are literally thousands of these, and they're not taking place in UK because the 5G networks aren't there. The human capital is there in UK. The know-how is in UK. It's just the networks are being thwarted because there is a policy regime which does not let them emerge.
And you've mentioned the networks. You've mentioned, and say, to defend the UK networks, we are all mobile operators are rolling out 5G, and a number of them now are over 50% of the population. But there's still some way to go. And you mentioned the investment gap. The Digital Connectivity Forum found between 10 to 25 billion pounds to get advanced 5G deployed across the UK. But a big part of that as well is about attracting investment and ensuring the UK is a place to invest. And I'd be keen just to your thoughts of how net neutrality makes the UK investable or in these instances less investable, because these are big figures we're talking about.
Right, absolutely. Well, I think this has a lot to do with the sort of entrepreneurial impulse as well as the investor's willingness. I mean, essentially, net neutrality says, if you want to build a network, you must price all the data the same. You cannot manage your network efficiently. You're not allowed to have partnerships, and you can't have premium and differentiated offers. So if you are the network owner, you've essentially made your network not a very attractive proposition. You can't use it efficiently, you can't earn a return on investment, and it's going to be very difficult for you to attract investors under such an arrangement. In comparison to all of your competitors, let's say in all the technology industries, they're allowed to do all of those things. They can have differentiated pricing. They're allowed to use two-sided market models. They are allowed to do partnerships. They can treat the traffic however they want to on the network. So it's also anti-competitive. And for that reason, this is why the UK is suffering this gap of 340 billion pounds. And I would say the indirect effects of that is this sort of concern by innovators and broadband providers because they don't want to try things because they're afraid they're going to be penalized. So these rules are very hard to understand. They're very arcane in how they're described. So the legal counsel in any company says, don't do it. We don't know if we're going to violate some rule. And that's exactly why during the pandemic, the mobile operators wanted to provide free services, but they couldn't because they knew this violated the net neutrality rules. Ofcom had to suspend those rules so they could actually serve their end users and provide the education and health online that people wanted.
And you mentioned the rules, and it's something we all hear about, the net neutrality rules, net neutrality regulations. They're there to protect. But we have countries out there that don't have net neutrality rules, or they have soft rules or self-regulation. And I mean, the view is that if you sort of use the language that you've got to have these rules, and if you take those rules away, you almost get the Wild West out there. Companies will exploit that. But what is the experience internationally where countries haven't got those rules?
Well,
the US.
Look no further than Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea. Australia and New Zealand have never had these rules. They have always had very strong competition regimes. And so they've never felt the need. And today you see a lot of innovation in video gaming, in fact. So they accept that the network can do a lot of cool things. Let's allow it. And we have competition law in the background to deal with things as if and when they happen. So that's there. I think South Korea and Japan, they're very exciting examples because they're countries where they are extremely innovative. They're very high investment countries. South Korea actually exports content to the West, their platforms, their music, their movies. They're now the 7th largest content provider in the world. They came from nothing. And they're never going to have these kind of rules that say, end users are not allowed to have the products that they want, or they're not going to allow the innovators the capabilities of networks. The US is a great example because they actually experienced what happened when you had those rules in place, which was maybe a two and a half year period. The first thing that happened was that the network investment fell by almost 6%, which was about $3 or $4 billion.
This is when the US put the rules in.
Yes, in 2015, the US adopted rules, and then the next year, the investment fell. They fell for 2 subsequent years. As soon as the rules were removed, the investment surged back. You had a spectrum auction, which was a record. It raised $90 billion for the 5G spectrum. You had an unprecedented rollout in 5G networks. I mean, to put in perspective, there was something like, I think, 10,000 mobile towers were put up under the net neutrality rules, and when they were removed, that went to be, well over 100,000. I mean, it was like a night and day turnout. And especially when you look at rural areas. That's where I think you see the most stark situations. And for small providers, it's very hard for them to operate under these conditions because already they have limited number of subscribers, they have higher costs anyway. And so, the removal of rules has been a boon to the US economy. Certainly, the digital divide has narrowed significantly. The other thing is, during this, especially during the pandemic in the United States, the networks were available when they needed to be, and you had fortunately some runtime before that happened. But the mobile operators, rather than harming their consumers, they did all of the opposite things. They actually waived the late fees. They made more networks available. They did everything that they could to keep people online.
And they could do
Doing the opposite of what the net neutrality proponents would say. And this was also similar in UK. So I think that there's a notion, some people are concerned that if we didn't have specialized rules in place that, the broadband providers would overcharge the users or block their connections. That's basically, it's not profit maximizing to do that, particularly in a competitive economy because you can switch, but you don't want to have if you do that, your service just becomes less value. And the word of mouth is, I'm not going to use provider X because I have a bad experience. You don't want that kind of reputation. In today's economy, word travels instantly. People are very vocal about their experience. I mean, the strongest regulators are end users, in terms of how they, their expectations and what they demand. So, that has been, I actually have that's just come out in a book called Beyond the Pandemic, was published in the UK under Emerald Publishers. Very pleased to see that. I have systematically reviewed all of the regulatory offices in the United States. We have no reports of net neutrality violations during the pandemic. None. I have checked everywhere. All the press, all the Federal Trade Commission, everything at FCC. There's no reports that this happened. So that itself shows, and it is certainly the size of the economy of the United States with 340 million people, that broadband providers have a lot of pressure on their side, a lot of, how would you say, the self-regulation, if you will, to provide a quality experience. There's a real incentive to do that because there is competition in the marketplace, and that itself is driving the good behavior.
So there are incentives and disincentives in the system to keep checks and balances. There's competition law. It's not a matter of removing net neutrality as simply, as you say, there's no rules. There are, as you say, there's competition that maintains that experience.
Yes, and I would say the other area of this that, is, I go into it in the paper, but essentially, and I think Ofcom has recognized this, it's found that that net neutrality from the EU, it works for content providers, it works for big tech, but it doesn't work for consumers and it doesn't work for broadband providers. And Ofcom wants to have a system where everyone in the ecosystem can benefit. Everyone, the regime should work for everyone. It should not be for the benefit of big tech, but at the expense of consumers and at the expense of the next generation networks. So to Ofcom, to its credit, they're trying to evolve the policy so that what we call a Pareto optimal, meaning nobody is worse off. We want everybody to be better off with our policy.
And I think in your report, you mentioned that the vast amount of internet capacity and data throughput is actually by around 6 companies in the whole globe, and we're going to get more.
To me, it's been so interesting. These rules were adopted under the premise that we won't get the next Google unless we adopt these rules. So I've been very keen. I want to find where's the next Google going to be, which country. And interestingly enough, it emerges from China. It has not emerged from countries where there are net neutrality rules. And the other thing that's happened is since these rules are adopted, we have even more concentration in internet traffic than we had 10 years ago. I mean, I think that it's more than anyone expected. I mean, an order of 80% of the downstream traffic coming from 5 providers, from Netflix, from Amazon Prime, from Google YouTube, from some of these streaming companies, and Meta, and Microsoft, Xbox, and to some extent Apple, less so. But in any case, there's a concentration of of traffic from a few players, which interestingly enough were exactly the companies that wanted these rules in the first place. They put them in place after they had already attained these global positions that they have. They sort of freeze the status quo in place to assert them. And they're actually blocking competitors who could get it ahead by using the network capabilities, by using the capabilities that they could get with different sorts of specialized services and so on, paying for increased fidelity and sponsored data and all of these other arrangements. So it's interesting to me why competition authorities have been so slow to see this. I think that they're starting to realize it now, and they're recognizing that what they thought was perhaps it sounded good 10 years ago, is actually not playing out well, and they're realizing that we've created this very sort of pernicious market concentration. And by the way, I'm not the only one who said this. I mean, there's a leading competition expert in UK, Olaise Andriuk. He has also noted this. He said that essentially we eliminate the capability for disruptive innovation to big tech because of these rules. And also game theory researchers have shown how these regulations are deterring the very competition that we want. And the UK's had to set up an entire regulatory agency to regulate big tech. They could have just looked and said, why adopt a policy that's going to help them over anyone else? Why not maintain the competition that we need? And so here we are. We have to go back now and create regulatory solutions to fix the problems that we created with bad policy.
I think it's also interesting just to take as a case study of this is that differentiating the product, infrastructure providers can't do that, yet if you look at a sort of typical streaming service, you can differentiate that on HD, SD or Ultra 4K.
Well, not only that, consider what does Netflix do? They have an advertising supported product, right? Broadband providers are not allowed to do that. They have a product where, and I think it's on the order of, 30 million, many millions of users are already using their advertising supported product. So Netflix, to their credit, they have offering an ad-supported Netflix, but broadband providers are not allowed to do ad-supported broadband. I mean, and you can also understand what was the reason this was put in place was that Google and Meta did not want competition in the advertising industry, so they blocked the capability for broadband providers to do the very sort of marketing partnerships that they do. And so here we are today with even more market concentration, less competition yes.
Yeah, on that point of differentiate products and services, I just look at sort of 5G as a technology, and yet this is, I think, where we look at net neutrality and how technology has moved beyond and needs to move out of the restrictions that it has, because 5G offers things like private networks, 5G slicing, which are exactly what we would like to be able to do, but like we go back to the zero rating, you can't change that within net neutrality.
Right. So, some regulators thought that they have made these carve-outs, you can do a 5G slice, or you can do this or that, or you can do specialized service. In practice, broadband providers are very reticent. They are very risk-averse to trying to do that for fear of violating the rules. They are trying to obey the law as much as possible. But these are, so they don't try things. And I think that that's really, if the UK wants to become the global leader in industry, in 5G, whatever it is, they have to be able to get all the parties on board. You have to allow all the parties to take advantage of the economics that are there, the partnerships are there. You're not serving your enterprises by saying you're only allowed to innovate in one way. You need to allow them the range of capabilities, the range of partnerships that we don't even know who's going to work together. But if they don't have that freedom to innovate, you're not going to get the growth that you want, the leadership that you want, that emergence. And you can certainly see when you look at the countries which are 5G leaders, as I said, Japan, South Korea, US, China, they allow their homegrown enterprises that freedom to innovate.
Well, Roslyn, I think we are sitting at a stage where the UK government has indicated it wants to look at it. It wants to make sure that net neutrality is fit for purpose. We have a regulator who is looking itself at how the guidelines work and what needs to be done. So we actually luckily, I think this is a good opportunity. We're at a period where it is there's positive outcomes from here, and I think from my point of view, look, Roslyn, this has been fascinating. I think we could talk for hours on this. It is a topic that I think is going to run. So if I could say thank you very much for being part of this inaugural podcast and on our Living Better Connected series, it's been great. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again.